Uncanny Valley, Chapter 2. The Butcher of Uncanny Valley. The bell above the door let out a weak jingle as Orson stepped inside. A wave of chilled air greeted him, thick with the scent of raw meat and something faintly metallic. The floor was black and white checkered tile, pristine despite years of use, and the glass display case stretched along the length of the shop, its contents neatly arranged: thick slabs of beef, pale cuts of pork, strings of sausage looped in tight coils. Behind the counter, a broad-shouldered man stood sharpening a cleaver against a whetstone. The slow, rhythmic scrape of metal on stone echoed in the quiet space. The butcher looked up, his face stretching into a polite, practiced grin. "Hey, Orson, what can I get you?" Orson stopped mid-step. "I'll have his brow furrowed. "Wait, what did you just say?" The butcher didn't hesitate. "I said, what can he get you?" A faint prickling sensation ran along the back of Orson's neck. Had he imagined it? He must have. He was still half asleep, shaken by the restless night, his mind caught in that strange fog between wakefulness and dreaming. Still, for a moment he swore the man had said his name. But that wasn't possible. Orson exhaled, shaking off the unease. "Right, yeah, I'll take a pound of bacon." The butcher nodded, turning to retrieve the order. As the man moved, Orson let his gaze wander around the shop, taking in the small details. It was cleaner than he expected, spotless really. Not a single smear of blood on the counter. No stray bits of gristle clinging to the cutting boards. Even the butcher's apron, though streaked with the telltale red of his trade, seemed orderly. Orson shifted, crossing his arms over his chest as he glanced toward the display case. The meat inside was fresh, vibrant reds, smooth marbling, each cut so uniform it was almost unnatural. He frowned, his eyes catching on something at the very back of the case. A single slab of meat, darker than the rest. Not old. No, it didn't look spoiled, but different. The texture wasn't quite right. The grain of the muscle, the curve of the fat, it almost looked like, there we go. Orson snapped his attention back to the counter as the butcher placed a neatly wrapped parcel of bacon before him. The man's smile remained polite and expectant, as if nothing had happened, as if the moment of strange familiarity never occurred. "That'll be $3 even." Orson hesitated, the odd feeling still clinging to him like a damp fog. Then, with a small shake of his head, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5. "Keep the change," he muttered. The butcher's smile widened, not in gratitude, not in surprise, but in something else, something that set Orson's teeth on edge. He told himself he was imagining things, just tired, just hungry, just off from the long drive and the new surroundings. The butcher took the bill and placed it in the register with a soft clink. "You settling in all right?" Orson blinked. "Huh?" "In town," the butcher clarified. He set his cleaver down beside him, folding his thick arms across his chest. "You moved in, right?" Orson hesitated, feeling another small ripple of unease roll through him. "Yeah, just got in yesterday." The butcher nodded as if he already knew. "Big house, that one, lot of history." Orson frowned. "You know it? Everyone does." There was something peculiar about the way he said it. Not ominous, not even suspicious, just factual, like stating the sky was blue or the water was wet. Orson shifted his weight, glancing toward the door. The bell above it stood still. No breeze stirred the dust in the corners of the shop, and yet he felt the faintest impression that something had changed since he walked in. A shift in the air, a subtle, imperceptible thing, like walking into a room where someone had just been talking, only to find silence. He cleared his throat, pushing away the sensation. "Well, thanks for the bacon." The butcher nodded. "See you around, Orson." Orson froze. The man had said his name again. He didn't react, didn't question it. This time he let it go. Instead, he grabbed his parcel of bacon, gave a small nod in return, and stepped toward the door. The bell gave another faint jingle as he left, stepping into the cold morning air. and behind him, the butcher stood motionless behind the counter. Orson exhaled, watching his breath curl in the crisp air, shaking off the lingering unease from the conversation inside. It was fine, just his nerves, just a new place, new faces. He had imagined it. Still, something gnawed at him, a whisper of doubt curling at the edges of his mind. He turned back. Through the large front window of Foster's butchery, the scene inside remained unchanged. The clean white tiles, the pristine glass display, the butcher behind the counter. The butcher moved. Orson watched as the man grabbed the heavy cleaver from the counter and turned, disappearing through the door behind him. For a brief moment, as the door swung open, Orson caught a glimpse inside. A walk-in cooler, large, industrial, its steel interior gleaming under flickering fluorescent light. And hanging from thick metal hooks, Orson's breath caught in his throat. Not pork, not beef, bodies. Human bodies. Stripped of skin in some places, limbs bound in twine, the flesh marbled like prime cuts of steak. The cold air from the open cooler swirled out into the shop, misting slightly, and just before the door swung shut, a head. A human head. Slack-jawed, its lifeless eyes staring directly at him as if accusing him. Orson staggered back, the parcel of bacon slipping from his grasp. His stomach lurched. His mind screamed at him to run, to turn away, to forget. But his body was frozen, locked in a moment of raw, sickening horror. The door clicked shut. The butcher was gone, the scene erased. The street stretched quiet and empty around him, indifferent to the pounding of his pulse. For a long moment, Orson simply stood there, staring at his own ghostly reflection in the butcher's window, his breath coming too fast and too shallow. Then, with trembling hands, he fumbled for his phone. The police arrived within minutes. 2 officers, small-town types. One older, grizzled, his mustache peppered with gray. The other younger, fresh-faced, though his expression was already weary, as if he had been through this routine too many times before. Orson stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed tightly over his chest as he watched them step inside the butcher's shop. The older officer, Sergeant Davis, his badge read, gave Orson a measured look before following his partner inside. The bell above the door gave a soft jingle. Orson held his breath. From his place outside, he could see them speaking with the butcher. The conversation was brief, calm. He couldn't hear what was being said, but the butcher laughed. Laughed, shaking his head as if amused by the entire thing. The younger officer gestured toward the cooler. Orson tensed. The butcher hesitated only a moment before nodding and pushing open the heavy steel door. The officer stepped inside. Orson inched closer to the window, watching, waiting. Any second now they would see it, the bodies, the hooks, the pale, lifeless faces staring back at them. They would call for backup. They would arrest the butcher. The officers emerged. The door swung shut behind them. They said something to the butcher. The young officer gestured toward the cooler again, but his expression had softened, his suspicion melting into something more like patience. Orson's pulse pounded in his ears. The butcher smiled. The officers turned and walked back outside. Sergeant Davis tucked his thumbs into his belt, sighing through his nose. Mr. Glass, was it? Orson nodded stiffly, his stomach still a tight, twisted knot. The officer studied him for a moment before speaking again, his voice slow and measured. We checked the cooler, nothing out of the ordinary. Orson's mouth went dry. That's not possible. I saw, son, Davis interrupted, his tone shifting into something almost sympathetic. You just moved in, right? Orson swallowed. Yeah? Long drive? Yeah? You get much sleep last night? Orson hesitated. Davis sighed again. Look, I get it. New town, new surroundings. Maybe your mind's just playing tricks on you. It happens to folks, especially out here. The quiet can get to you. Orson shook his head. No, you thought you saw something. The older officer's voice was patient but firm. But we just walked through that cooler ourselves. Just beef and pork, that's it. Orson stared at him, disbelieving. It wasn't possible. It had been there. The bodies, the head, it had been there. But the officers had seen nothing. Nothing at all. Davis clapped a hand on Orson's shoulder, the weight of it heavy, grounding. "Go home, Mr. Glass. Get some rest." Orson barely registered the words, "Go home, get some rest," as if that would somehow fix this. As if he had imagined it. As if it hadn't been real. The officers turned back toward their cruiser. The butcher lingered in the doorway of his shop, watching Orson with that same polite, practiced smile. Not smug, not gloating, just watching. Orson clenched his fists. He didn't say another word. Instead, he picked up the fallen parcel of bacon, his hands still trembling, and turned away. The butcher's smile never wavered. And as Orson walked away, he could still feel the butcher's eyes on his back, calm, patient, like someone who has seen this all before. The tires whispered against the wet pavement as Orson turned onto the main road, one hand tightening on the wheel, the other clutching the small white-wrapped package of bacon. His stomach twisted at the thought of it. He told himself it was just meat. But he couldn't shake the image of what he had seen in that cooler. Orson exhaled sharply through his nose and rolled down the window. The cool autumn air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and burning leaves. He clenched his jaw. This is ridiculous. I didn't see anything. And yet, as the next intersection approached, he found himself pressing his foot harder on the gas, speeding up just enough to bring the garbage bin on the corner into reach. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the bacon out of the car. The package hit the inside of the bin with a dull thump, vanishing among the crumpled fast food wrappers and broken beer bottles. Orson set his jaw and faced forward, gripping the wheel until his knuckles paled. There. That was that. He told himself the nausea would pass, that it was fine, that he wasn't disturbed, that he was simply not in the mood for meat. But the moment the bacon was gone, the very idea of eating it left his mind completely, like something heavy had been lifted from his chest. His appetite, however, hadn't vanished entirely. The grocery store sat at the far end of town, a squat brick building with weathered glass doors and a faded sign that read Hanson's General Goods. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for an old pickup truck near the back and a bicycle leaned against the side of the building. Orson pulled into the space near the entrance and shut the engine off. The silence that followed felt too deep, the absence of the car's hum pressing in around him. With a sigh, he stepped out and headed inside. The automatic doors slid open without a sound. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dry grain and cold refrigeration. A weak, yellowish light bathed the aisles, casting shadows that felt longer than they should have. The store was sparsely stocked, small-town inventory, but neat, as if every item had been placed with meticulous care. A soft, warbling tune drifted down from the ceiling speakers, some old melody, big band jazz from the 40s, crackling faintly, as though playing from a distant radio. Orson grabbed a basket and moved through the aisles, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. Bread, eggs, milk, coffee. But as he pulled a carton of milk from the cooler, something made him pause. He turned the container in his hand, his brow furrowing. The label wasn't quite right. The brand name was off. Something generic-looking, printed in an odd, almost mechanical font that didn't match any that he had seen before. And the words underneath, French farm milk, always good, always fresh. Orson frowned. His eyes flickered toward another shelf. Eggs, big and healthy. Delish meat, cut for you. His grip tightened around the milk carton. It was just off-brand, he told himself. Some small-town supplier with terrible marketing, that was all. But still, it felt like someone had tried to make it look normal. Like whoever was in charge of stocking this place almost understood how products should be labeled, but not quite. Orson exhaled through his nose and tossed the milk into the basket, moving on. Near the back of the store, the aisles gave way to a long corridor. A single metal sign hung above it, employees only. Orson slowed, peering down the hallway. The corridor stretched deeper than he expected, lined with closed doors leading to the storage areas, offices, maybe even a break room. The light overhead buzzed faintly, the fluorescence too white and too cold against the dull yellow of the store. The lights began shutting off, one by one. Pop, pop, pop. The darkness rolled forward like a living thing, devouring the space section by section, the farthest bulbs extinguishing first, the void creeping toward him. Orson's breath hitched, and in the ink-black maw, movement. Faint, subtle, something shifted just beyond the darkness, something large. A long, impossible shape, barely visible against the void, like a mass of tangled limbs or shifting silhouettes. Its form writhed, slow and undulating, as though adjusting itself, settling, waiting. Orson's chest tightened, his instincts screaming at him to move. "Can I help you find anything, Orson?" He flinched violently. A voice. Orson turned sharply, heart hammering, eyes locking onto the grocer. A middle-aged man with a lined face and dull brown eyes, standing unnervingly close, smiling with polite vacancy. Orson turned back toward the corridor. The lights were on. The hallway stood empty, bright and ordinary. His pulse pounded in his ears. "What?" Orson started, his voice hoarse, and he turned back. "How do you know my name?" The grocer smiled and faltered, didn't blink. "What? I assure you I don't know what you're talking about, sir." The words came too fast, too smooth, as though rehearsed. "Can I help you get checked out?" Orson stared at him. The moment stretched long and thin, like a strand of fraying thread. Then, finally, he exhaled, forcing a small, humorless chuckle. Yeah, let's do that." He followed the grocer to the checkout counter. The cashier rang him up in silence, fingers moving fluidly, scanning each item without hesitation, without looking. Orson paid, took his bag. The music still played, that same old warbling jazz crackling from the speakers. Forcing himself to ignore the unease curling at his gut, he pushed through the sliding glass doors, stepping into the cold air. The doors began to slide shut behind him. The music stopped. A brief, static silence filled the store. Then over the speakers, a voice, garbling, hissing. "You should eat, Orson. You need your strength." Orson froze mid-step. Slowly, he turned back. The store stood silent, still. No music, no sound. Only the grocer standing behind the counter, watching, smiling. Orson's grip tightened on the plastic bag. He didn't go back inside. He didn't ask if he had imagined it. Instead, he turned towards his car, moving stiffly, pulse hammering. He had almost convinced himself that he had misheard it. Almost. But as he pulled out of the parking lot, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching. And that same thought whispered at the edges of his mind, curling around him like a breath against his ear. "You should eat, Orson. You need your strength."